on order. The Foreign Affairs Committee is very pleased to have as our witness today the Honorable William K. Riley, the Administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, who headed the U.S. delegation to the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development. It took us a long time to get to Stockholm Conference. It took us 20 years to get to Rio Conference. And one considers the monumental effort that went into the preparatory meetings and the discussions and the end product of a worldwide conference on a subject that is as emotional as any subject that confronts mankind. There are 5 major documents that came out of this international conference. Is that correct, or more?
There's the Rio Declaration, Agenda 21, Convention on Biological Diversity, Climate Change Convention, and the Declaration of Principles on Forestry. I think that's correct. Yes, sir.
Now, is each of those documents a statement of principle?
The 2 conventions are binding on the parties, legally binding. And the other declaration for forestries and so forth do not have legally binding significance.
Now, the difference, of course, is what in international law?
Well, in terms of international law, depending upon the provisions for dispute resolution and for enforcement, there are actions that can be brought to enforce a treaty by one party against another. So with respect to the Agenda 21 or the Declaration of Principles on Forestry, they are, I suppose, statements of intent, statements of priority and commitment. In some cases, I think, moral obligations, but they are not matters that one can have a legal action to enforce.
Not legally binding. Well, we've seen in the case of the Helsinki Accords that a statement of principles which binds nations morally can be effective. It can be effectively implemented as well, depending on the will of the participants. And that agreement itself has no self-executing enforcement mechanism. Neither is it binding as a matter of law, but as a moral statement, as an agreement among nations. And I take it these 3 agreements at the Rio Conference, which are not conventions, are in that same general category. They're guidelines for nations to pursue by virtue of the commitment each has made to the other. Implementation is unilateral, but the group itself can meet, I suppose, from time to time and make its own judgment as to who's complying and who's not complying, even though there's no legal obligation.
Yes, sir, that's correct. I think there was some criticism in Rio of that matter and of the fact that some of the agreements are not legally binding. And I was reminded by those very declarations you refer to on human rights. I can recall some of the human rights community criticized the lack of enforcement, and yet Václav Havel and the Velvet Revolution and Lech Walesa and a lot of others made extremely effective use of those commitments. They did, in fact, achieve a distinction and a cachet in many parts of the world where that was important, and I think had a significant effect. I would expect that this will be true also for many of the commitments in these 3 documents.
Well, I think so too. Now, still talking about the 3 documents that are not conventions or legally binding, are there any plans at the moment for any kind of follow-on or follow-up with respect to implementation?
Yes, sir. We have developed a plan within the administration to follow up on the commitments that we have made. We will have a follow-up session, in fact, next week on forestry, for which
well, I didn't mean just internally in the U.S., although we're very interested in that, and I'll let you proceed on that so we can get a clear understanding of what we're talking about as far as the U.S. is concerned. But I'm also interested in the international aspects of follow-on.
The principal forum for monitoring progress will be new United Nations Commission on Sustainable Development, which is to be established as part of the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations.
Will that be new representatives to the ECOSOC, or will that be the same representatives?
That has not been decided. Will be worked out, I think, at the United Nations General Assembly in the fall. There are some 54 member countries in ECOSOC, and I would assume that given the careful regional inclusiveness of that body, that it would offer us enough countries to at least begin that commission with, and avoid having to take the long time it would involve, I'm sure, if we went to another alternative. But that has not been definitively decided.
All right, now let's go to the conventions now for just a moment. What is the enforcement or the follow-on mechanism of the conventions?
The Convention on Climate Change, which was signed by 154 countries, is one that we expect to submit to our Senate for ratification next month, as soon as the documents arrive from the United Nations. We have committed also to a prompt start, and I think the G7 countries will agree to most of the proposals we have made. That is to begin to actually act as though it were in force before it comes into force. We will propose an action plan toward the end of this year and complete it by January 1st. We'll submit it for early ratification. We'll begin to fund developing country energy projects, demonstration projects, and the like, and continue to support scientific research and monitoring of climate change at a very high level. I think a little over $1.4 billion in the fiscal year 93 proposed, and expect periodically to review, just as we did with respect to the upper atmospheric ozone issue in the Montreal Protocol, the emerging science, technology, and economics of climate change.